Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final in our series of webcasts discussing the importance of advances in statistical genetics and the potential for anti-selection that ensues from those advances. So to recap what we've learned in our previous webcasts. In the first webcast, we set the scene and learnt about how advances in genomics are driving medicine and have great potential to improve human longevity and healthy longevity at that. But with that growth comes potential for anti-selection as more and more people have access to their own genetic data. In the second webcast, Dr. Richard Russell led us through the basics of genetics, through to explaining the concept of polygenic risk scores and discussed some of the applications in medicine of polygenic risk scores. In the previous webcast, Professor Catherine Lewis of King's College talked us through the results of the RGA-funded study into the amazing UK Biobank study. Now, in this fourth webcast, we'll bring that all together and talk about the potential risks of anti-selection for the life insurance industry. So, the concerns around anti-selection insurance arising from genetic data have been around for a long time, and so consequently there's been quite a lot of research into this. I'd like to just call out a couple of key pieces here. So the report in 2009 looking at the probability of people buying long-term care insurance when in the presence of the Huntington disease causing genetic mutations is, I think, still the only paper we've seen that really looks at the consumer buying behaviour changes that occur in the presence of anti-selective genetic data. And that study showed that those people that had the gene mutations that caused them to have Huntington's disease at some point in their future life, they were 5 times more likely than general population to buy long-term care insurance. So a significant change in purchasing behaviour. The second series of studies I'd like to just call out is the work of Angus MacDonald at Heriot-Watt University. His Genetics and Insurance Research Centre has published nearly 35 papers between 1997 and 2015. And a lot of that work really was ahead of its time, including a paper in 2006 talking about the biobank and opining on some of the results that might be seen from the biobank research, which correspond with what Catherine presented in the webcast earlier. So the thing about all of these studies is that they really don't agree with each other. There's a very wide impact reported of the impact of anti-selection on insurance claims. And why is that wide range? Because there's a lot of uncertainty in assumptions, and assumptions fall into 2 main categories. One is around the science. So what is the number of people that have got the genetic mutations? What are the number of people that then go on to develop the disease? And what's that impact then on the actual insurance claim criteria, often death? The second set of assumptions is around how insurance buying behaviour changes, and there's really great uncertainty. And from the biobank research, what we were hoping to do is really develop the quality of those scientific assumptions. Using a high quality data set with long-term follow-up, we could work through and remove the need for making assumptions where we had certainty from the data set. That said, we've got nothing extra to offer around consumer buying behaviour, and that is an area where we think more research and more study is needed. The biobank work does increase our understanding of the science considerably, but we have to note that predicting risk from polygenic risk scores is still early. There may be additional genetic mutations discovered which allow these scores to become more predictive. From an insurance point of view, there may be additional developments in understanding how the polygenic risk scores interact with our traditional rating factors and indeed other elements of health and lifestyle. But an important caveat that you see on many of these polygenic risk score studies is that generally all of these studies are being done on Caucasian white populations, and more work is needed to understand how they would extrapolate out to other populations. We've seen some early studies as well which link the high degree of risk from a polygenic risk score to the severity of the onset of that disease as well. And that could have important implications for critical illness policies, particularly staged critical illness policies. Perhaps the biggest challenge here is that we just don't know about human behaviour again. If people are exposed to information about their genetic risks, will that lead them to take lifestyle action and change their lifestyle to reduce that risk? We certainly would hope so, but studies at the moment are somewhat ambiguous on that outcome. We've seen papers that suggest that people will change their lifestyle in the presence of genetic data that indicates they are at high risk, whereas we've also seen studies which suggest that people don't change their lifestyle at all. So we still don't understand that very important aspect of genetic risk. So let's just recap the results that Catherine shared in the previous webcast. And here we're going to particularly work on the results that she presented for breast cancer. Now, just to kind of put these results into context for insurance, let's think about smoking as a risk factor. So in many developed countries, you can approximate the proportion of smokers and non-smokers to be 80% non-smokers and 20% smokers. So looking at these breast cancer scores, if we take the average relative risk for the best 80% of lives and the relative risk on average for the worst 20% of lives and divide the two by each other, the ratio of those relative risks is 1.85. Now, if you compare that to the smoking risk factor, generally we think that's about 2.5. So this 1.85 ratio doesn't quite reach the level of smoking differentiation, but is still extremely powerful. So what we're going to present now are 3 scenarios illustrating what could happen to the risk pool if consumer purchasing behaviour changes. Now, as I said earlier, there's huge uncertainty around how consumer buying behaviour could change in the presence of genetic data. So although these scenarios become less and less severe as we move through them, I'm not willing to label any of them as being pessimistic, optimistic, or anything of that nature. We just don't know. So what we do here, we start with the scores from the previous slide, and here we say that the consumer purchasing behaviour is going to change according precisely to the genetic risk that the test results show. So what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is that if you're in the best 1% of lives, you're told that you're at a 40% less risk of developing breast cancer, and so you become 40% less likely to buy insurance. And consequently, at the other end of the scale, where you are 2.61 times more likely to develop breast cancer, we say you're 2.61 times more likely to buy life insurance. Okay, so if we multiply all of those numbers through, obviously the risk pool changes, and then when we take a weighted average of the risk before and after the buying behaviour change, we can see what the impact is on insurance costs. So what do we see when we multiply out and divide these new risk pools by each other? We see a 13% increase in risk arising from the use of this polygenic risk score. And then when we add in, as Richard spoke about earlier, the increased risk from the high penetrance BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, that increase in risk goes up to 16%. So a significant change in the risk pool from this change in purchasing behaviour. In our second scenario, we halve the change in the consumer buying behaviour. Now clearly that halving in risk just scales straight through, and we see that this time we see a 7% increase just based on the polygenic risk score, and an 8% increase once you add in the BRCA genes to that polygenic risk score. So still a significant impact despite the fact we've halved the change in consumer buying behaviour. And in our third scenario, we change the behaviour for those people who are at low risk of the disease. So here we reflect the fact that there's many reasons why someone wants to buy insurance, and so just because you've been told that you're at low risk of developing breast cancer won't necessarily change your buying behaviour. So if you're in the lower half of risk from the polygenic risk score, we assume you don't change your buying behaviour. But if you're in the top half, then we assume you change your buying behaviour as we did in the previous scenario. Here we see a lower increase in risk, but is still a significant increase in risk. Considering just the polygenic risk scores, increase in risk is just under 5%, but when you add in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, then you end up with an increase in risk in the risk pool of about 5.5%. So again, a significant impact. So before we move off these scenarios, just 2 final comments. One, we've made no assumption in these scenarios for any preventative action consumers may take to reduce the onset of their disease if they know they're at higher risk of the onset of disease. And the second thing just to note, we've only presented results for breast cancer in this webcast, but in the previous webcast that Catherine Lewis presented, we also talked about results from the study into coronary artery disease. The results are pretty similar for both, so that's why we've just presented the one set of scenarios. To sum up and in conclusion of our study, we've noted through our webcasts that the world of genetics is changing. It's moving from considering rare, high penetrance genes to thinking about common variants which lead to the onset of common diseases. We've demonstrated that in that common disease, common variant model, you can use things called polygenic risk scores to assess the risk of individuals. Those polygenic risk scores provide information on the spread of risk between those at low risk and at those of high risk of developing a disease. The spread between low and high risk is high. We've presented numbers in this presentation for breast cancer and cardiovascular disease that talk about the worst lives having a 2.5 times higher risk than the average life in the population, and therefore that opens the door potentially to anti-selection within the insurance industry if insurers don't have access to that same data in making their risk decisions. That point around risk decisions potentially not being as accurate is very important because we have demonstrated through the biobank study that existing underwriting risk factors do not provide any additional protection against this. That's to say that polygenic risk scores are a new orthogonal risk rating factor in addition to what is normally used in the insurance industry. We see the potential for anti-selection being higher because there are many ways now to access your genetic data without any way of the insurance company knowing, and that's even before considering potential regulatory change, which seems to be moving across the globe to be banning of insurance companies having access to this data. Despite all of that, polygenic risk scores we believe are still in their infancy. We consider them to be an emerging risk issue for the insurance industry, and so further research is needed. RGA will be continuing our research collaboration with King's College London to further develop the science, looking at a wider degree of illnesses and hopefully working towards looking at outcomes for mortality. Additional research on consumer buying behaviour changes is definitely required. But finally, I'll return to one of the key messages from the first webcast, in that this series of webcasts has been somewhat negative, thinking about the risks to the insurance industry from anti-selection, but overall we think that advances in genetics and genomic medicine will play a major role for society in future and will drive better life expectancy and healthy life expectancy at that. I thank you for your attention through this series of 4 webcasts. If you have any questions, please do email me at the email address being shown on your screen now. If you've missed any of the webcasts and would like to go back and view them now, they are all available at the website address shown below. Thank you very much.